Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the last event in our Political Economy and History workshop here at the UMass Economics Department. I have a long list of thank yous to get through here. So I'd firstly like to thank Perry for co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to thank the UMass Economics Department, the Labour Centre here at UMass, and STEPIC, the Social Theory and Political Economy Department here, as well as the German department at the university, at Amherst College. And I would also like to thank the Five College Lecture Fund for also sponsoring this event. So many thank yous all round. We're here today to reflect on the New English translation of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, which was published last year by Princeton University Press. Unfortunately, the translator, Paul Reitter, wasn't able to join us today, but the book's editor, Paul North, kindly agreed to join us. So we also have three prominent interpreters of Marx's work who will be presenting on the significance of the translation, and I will introduce them shortly, but first I wanted to give a brief set of remarks setting the stage for our workshop today. So in his recent book, Karl Marx in America, the historian Andrew Hartman shows that the first English translation of Capital probably was published in 1871, when the American chapter of the International Working Man's Association distributed the Working Day chapter as a leaflet during a demonstration for the 8-hour day. So that this English pamphlet should appear in New York only 4 years after the original publication of the German original wouldn't have come as a surprise to Marx. After all, Marx specifically requested that a New York publisher be listed on the title page of the German edition because he was keen that his book be read in the German émigré community of New York, which he knew was teeming with socialists at the time. And I think he was not wrong to expect a readership in New York. The historian Timothy Meza-Cruz describes this milieu of artisans, many of whom were exiles from 1848, who had become abolitionists in America, many of them. He describes them as immersed in theoretical discussions of Das Kapital as early as 1870. Marx's friend Friedrich Sorge later wrote that of the 100 or so German socialists that he met in New York, hardly one had not read Marx. Anonymous members of this group would later translate and publish many chapters of Capital, and these early American translations began to circulate in Britain in the late 1870s, a decade before the first official translation was published under Engels' supervision. So I mention these English translations, these early English translations of Capital, not to boost the place of America in the history of reception of Marx's work, though it's notable that it took 150 years for these fragmentary editions to cohere into a first full American edition today, but rather to note that the first readers and translators of Capital were workers and not academics. So of the many firsts associated with this new edition, I wanted to stress that it is also the first edition of Capital in 150 years to be published by a university press. Academics, especially academics in our own discipline of economics, have generally not been kind to Capital, to the book, or to Marx himself, dismissing it, if not entirely hostile to the work. And that's, of course, not surprising, given that they are often the butt of Marx's jokes, picking apart the foolishness of various simplified ideas or narrow horizons among the vulgar apologists, in his view, for bourgeois capitalism. Yet the book has consistently resonated with many generations of workers, despite its intimidating scale and breadth. So, it is a very heavy book. You would not think it would be a bestseller among the working class, but the reason that for its popularity, I think, should be really quite obvious to any reader. Capital is a book written for workers and not for academics. In his afterword to the second German edition, which this translation is based on, Marx wrote that the appreciation which Das Kapital rapidly gained in wide circles of the German working class is the best reward of my labours. Marx's daughter Jenny wasn't so convinced that they were as receptive as he thought. She complained that if the workers had an inkling of the sacrifices that were necessary for this work, which was written only for them and for their sakes to be completed, they would perhaps show a little more interest. And among the sacrifices that she's describing were those of Marx's family, who had to put up with him for the 15 years or longer that it took him to work on this book, but also the carbuncles that accumulated on Marx's behind as he sat in the British Library for endless hours writing this tome. And he described that as that the bourgeoisie would remember his carbuncles until their dying day. Nevertheless, though it was clearly an exaggeration for Engels to describe capital as the Bible of the working class, after all, the Bible of the working class is the Bible, it is true that workers as well as déclassé intellectuals remained the book's core readers for over a century. That only began to change in the 1960s, and it was again in the US that change first really began to appear. A new generation of leftists entered the professoriate, and the department we're in today is in some ways the product of that change. And the benefits of that change, that development, I think are evident in this work, in the immense scholarly apparatus that it contains. But I wonder if there are also not some costs to this. After all, if Marx had hoped that the bourgeoisie will remember his carbuncles until their dying day, it is not because he thought he had sufficiently skewered this or that vulgar apologist for the bourgeoisie, but because he trusted that his book would become a weapon in the hands of the exploited and the oppressed. And I think it served that function with decidedly mixed results, one must say, for much of the 20th century. Whether it can still serve that function today or might again come to fulfill that in the future is one of the questions I'd like us to consider today. So with that brief introduction, I want to briefly introduce our four speakers. Our first speaker is William Clare Roberts, Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University and the author of Marx's Inferno, The Political Theory of Capital. Our second speaker is Beverly Best, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University, and she's the author of Marx and the Dynamic of Capital Formation. And our third speaker is E. Amit Tonak, lecturer here at the Political Science Department at UMass, and he's the author of Measuring the Wealth of Nations, co-author of Measuring the Wealth of Nations, and In the Tracks of Marx's Capital. And then finally, as a respondent here, we have the book's editor, Paul North. Paul is the Morris Tansen Professor of German at Yale University, and his books include The Problem of Distraction, The Yield, and Bizarre Privileged Items in the Universe. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Will.
Great, thank you. I'd like to, first of all, thank John Clegg for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of it. It's an honor to be here. I'm sorry that we can't all be here together in person, and especially that Paul Reitter was not able to join us. It was over 6 years ago now that Paul first told me he was undertaking a new translation of Capital, and I thought he was crazy but valiant, and I've been enthusiastic about his efforts ever since. I hope and believe that the new translation will spur new and renewed reading, and that this will give rise to fresh debates and new insights. Everyone I know who has read the new translation comments on how fresh and strange the text seems to be. Of course, the most obvious distinction that sets Paul's translation apart from all the others that we have grown familiar with over the years is that it's the first translation into English of an edition of Capital that Marx actually sought to print, the second German edition of 1872. The third and fourth German editions were Frankenstein editions. They were sewn together by Engels from the second German edition with some bits from the French edition and from Marx's notes. The first English translation, first full English translation of 1886 by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling followed the third German edition, but supplemented this in a few places by reference to notes that Marx had given to Friedrich Sorge when his friend was considering the possibility of producing a full American edition in 1877. I wish that Sorge had carried through on that, but c'est la vie. The next full edition was undertaken in 1905 by Ernest Untermann for the Charles H. Kerr and Company. And Untermann translated volume 2 and 3 for the very first time into English But his version of Volume 1 used the more enabling as a basis, simply revising and amplifying it by reference to the fourth German edition. Cedar and Eden Paul's 1928 translation, which was published by Allen and Unwin, also followed the third German edition. And finally, the Ben Fowlkes translation, which was published under the auspices of the New Left Review, followed the edition of Capital that was published as volume 34 of the decidedly old left Marx Engels Werke. The Werke edition was itself based on the fourth edition, but with some further additions and subtractions that the East German editors neither explain nor justify anywhere, to my knowledge. This publication history, which is trivia on its own, I think it has a deeper significance, though. The editions undertaken by Engels after Marx's death, and I include here his editions of Volume 2 and Volume 3, all sought to give a final shape to Marx's critique of political economy, to round it off and to present it as more or less complete, at least in its theoretical part. Yes, there were elaborations that Marx would have added and connections that he would have filled in, but the reader could at least see Marx's intentions. This aim of Engels was understandable in the context of a rapidly expanding and increasingly militant and ambitious workers' movement. Engels thought that he was providing the German workers in particular with a crucial theoretical foundation for their efforts to build a mass workers' party and a new International Socialist Workers Association to replace the lost International Working Men's Association. Despite all of the disasters that were to befall the socialist workers' movement over the next several decades, the many international editions of Marx's work that emerged in the first third of the 20th century, I think were all animated by this same sense that a rising tide of workers' power and organization needed only some theoretical dikes and earthworks to direct it into a focused and almighty flood. That situation had changed dramatically by the 1960s and 1970s, when a new spate of editions, re-editions, and novel translations began to appear. The global new lefts did not take the existing organizations of the socialist workers' movement, unions, parties, states, to be the obvious bearers of anti-capitalist revolution. And they did not take Marx's work in the 3 or 4 volumes of Capital as the theoretical steering wheel of the movement, even if they still looked to Marx for theoretical inspiration. There had been multiple waves of new Marxes and new Marxisms. The 1844 manuscripts, the Grundrisse, the notebooks of Gramsci, these had all provided jolts of new thinking, the glimmer of unexplored possibilities. The goal could not be simply to marry Marx's completed theory and the workers' existing movement. Hence, it was no accident that the NLR edition tapped as a translator a social historian who would also translate Heinrich Grossman, that it begins with an 80-page preface by a Trotskyist, or that it appends a 120-page outtake from Marx's manuscripts of 1863, 1864, the results of the immediate process of production. Paths not taken, resources overlooked or buried by the existing socialist movements, these were what seemed needful. In the illustrative words of Patrick Murray, for example, the results, quote, belong to those recently available texts that continue to encourage a profound reinterpretation and reevaluation of Marx's mature work. Others include the Grundrisse, the Urtext, and the 1861-63 manuscript published in the Mega. Reading these manuscripts, we encounter Marx in a different voice. He sounds less studied, more at home, more philosophical, dialectical, and Hegelian. He is more prone to pursue incisive moral and sociological observations. Above all, the topic of the specific social form and purpose of labor and wealth is explicit and emphatic, close quote. An ambitious but protean and uncertain movement, the New Left sought out a Marx to match its humors. Less studied, more at home, more philosophical, dialectical, and Hegelian, more prone to pursue incisive moral and sociological observations. If Engels saw in the workers' movement a proof and confirmation of Marx's completed theory, the New Left saw in the unpublished and incomplete Marx the mirror of its own movement. So, taking these past instances as guideposts, what can we learn about the present form, or what can we learn about the present from this new edition of Capital? What is the world that it meets? What is or might be the significance of Capital for readers in the present? So, obviously and unfortunately, I have not left myself much time to flesh out answers to those questions, so I'm going to have to make do with a couple of brief observations. First, it's striking that this new translation, and this is despite some of Paul North's comments in his introduction, it treats Volume 1 of Capital as a finished product. It is, and here I'm just repeating myself, it is the first time that an edition that Marx sought to print has been translated in full into English. Regardless of how you feel about Marx's unpublished drafts and notes, I think you have to admit that, in fact, Volume 1 does stand on its own without the other books. In fact, it stood on its own without the other books 4 separate times in 3 separate languages. For that is how many times Marx saw it to publication during his life, in German, in French, and in Russian. Publication is a commitment to the independent existence of the book in the real world, among readers who will not wait until you publish volumes 2 and 3 to read and take lessons from volume 1. I think this choice to publish a new edition that takes its form from what Marx published is important. I think it gives to the book, regardless of the editor's intentions, a moment of irreducible historical distance. This is Capital as Marx published it in 1872. But it also recognizes in the book a claim to independence, a claim to possess the ability to persist through time and to be appropriated by an audience at an indeterminate moment in the future, by many such audiences, in fact. Second, and equally striking, this is the first English translation of Capital to be carried through by non-Marxists, not just by academics, but by non-Marxists. Indeed, of the 4 people besides Marx whose names appear on the volume, I'm the closest thing to a Marxist, and I have no party formation, no party membership, never have. This is definitely a post-Marxism edition of Capital. Neither, however, does this edition emerge from a movement looking to find itself in Marx. There has certainly been an upsurge in interest in socialism, in anti-capitalism, and in Marx of late, at least since 2008. Nonetheless, an upsurge in interest does not make a movement. The popular movements of this generation, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, the Gilets Jaunes, Standing Rock, the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd uprisings, the Movimento Passe Libre, the Tuberny campaigns, Ende Gelände, Gaza Solidarity Movement. These have generally been reactive, fairly disconnected, and anti-institutional. Their successes have been measured by what they were able to dismantle or refuse, not by whether they have been able to control the terms on which something new is built up afterwards. Indeed, in the face of climate catastrophe and openly genocidal war, a great refusal would understandably seem like a great victory. But that suggests to me that if there is a hunger for a fresh encounter with capital today, it may be rooted in a simple and desperate desire to understand the inner workings of the world that seems intent on crushing so many of us. That is not enough to sustain a movement. We need to figure out new ways of being and of living with one another. But it may be enough to get started. But I don't want to end there because I don't like that ending. That's a false note. I think it's not enough, and I want to end on a more pessimistic note, in fact. I think that the underlying commitment of Marx that shaped Capital and that shaped all of his work and that shaped his co-work with Engels was a commitment to the collective self-emancipation of the proletariat. And Marx and Engels thought that the self-emancipation of the working class would lead to universal emancipation. And so I think that if at this moment it's unclear what the audience of Capital is going to be, I think that's in part because that faith in the collective self-emancipation of the working class, I don't think we know how to make sense of that anymore. And so I think that is the question mark that I have hanging over the new edition of Capital. So thank you all.
Thanks, Will. Now, Beverly. Yes, thanks, Beverly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John, for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. The brief, I'm going to do something quite different from what Will just did. The brief for our panel was to either speak to the Paul and Paul's new translation of C1 as translation, or to say something new about, if possible, about the ongoing relevancy of the analysis in C1. So I am not equipped to do the former, so I'm going to attempt to do the latter. And it turns out that I had, before this invitation, turned back to C1 myself. I'm at the beginning of a project that about money, really, and about Marxist theory of money, and trying to focus on the first three chapters of Volume 1 to reconstruct Marxist theory of money, but with the objective of bringing it right up to the present and to bring it to bear on some really practical questions about money, and that I think are still somehow missing in a way, and maybe if in discussion we come back around to this, I won't say anything more about it other than to say that it's a kind of a three-part piece, and the little snippet that I'm going to share with you right now is comes at the end, where I think that Marx's theory of money actually tips or let's say can be a site of what he calls a dialectical reversal, so that it actually tips over into some kind of figure for what might come after capitalism, or what could possibly come after capital, or point to some kind of associated mode of production. And that sounds like a very unlikely thing to say about capitalist money, but that's what I'm going to try and argue. And this little snip is from that part of the larger project. So this is called Money and Its Lines of Flight. And like Marx, I'll begin with the idea of wealth, our wealth, as our collective doing, is that which could succeed and overflow wealth in its capitalist form, is that which has the potential to break open its enclosure as capitalist wealth. In the Grundrisse, Marx asks, what is wealth other than the universality of human needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange? The absolute working out of human beings' creative potentialities, making this development of all human powers as such the end in itself, unquote. For Marx, this wealth cannot be eradicated by capital because it doesn't originate with capital. It comes from before as possibility, is now caught inside, but looks beyond capital. It is wealth non-contemporaneous with capitalist wealth, not yet fully realized but extant as material possibility, i.e., the real historical substance of the commune. Now, this is not a typical way of thinking about wealth today, and certainly not its money form, on the part of either the critical theorist or bourgeois economist, and I'm interested in both for the moment. Let's stick with the critical theorist. More typically, in critical social theory, money is the avatar of capitalist domination, including the dynamic of economic crisis, so that money is both subjugator and fragility all at once. But the portrayal of capitalist society as a society under the rule of money wears the mask of Proudhon. The debate between Proudhon and Marx over money continues into the present. Today's Proudhon posits money itself as the problem. Too much money, too little money, get rid of money, invent new money, but call it something else. What if instead we think of money as the avatar of that collective wealth with which we began? Mutual indebtedness, the expansion of needs, capacities, and pleasures. Money which at its concept is the potential negation of property. In fact, that's the key. I'm suggesting that we think of money as the negation of property, and I'm putting out this alternative characterization of money, and I'm also claiming that it relies entirely on and is entirely consistent with Marx's theory of money. Based on that theory, we can think of money itself as the real but unrealized movement toward the commune. Following Marx, I suggest we can locate one standpoint on that all-crucial potential beyond capital at the core of capitalist money, that is, at its concept, a historical social content that animates a structural possibility, there for exploiting, should we take it up, collectively, intentionally. For Marx, the concept of capitalist money is a new mode of sociality that comes into existence in its perverted capitalist form, but which drives against its own capitalist integument. This is Marx's position in his debate with Proudhon. Let's not get rid of money. Rather, let's push straight through it and give real and practical expression to the pure sociality that constitutes, by logical necessity, money's concept. A sociality that, according to Marx, we must, if we're going to survive, separate from money's capitalist form. What capital introduces to the world, to history, including its independent value form, money, is the ineradicable future orientation of its movement, its drive to negate its own capitalist conditions and constraints. Now, Marx doesn't simply posit the idea that capitalist money is at its concept drive towards its own dissolution. He explains why, in a capitalist mode of production, it can be no other way. Now, just to point to that explanation, give me a moment to go back to another beginning, that of Capital Volume 1, where in the first 3 chapters, Marx walks readers through the logical formation of capitalist money, revealing what it is, or, same thing, different standpoint, what it does, because it is, according to Marx, a function, the function of universal equivalence, or one side of the putting into relation of every existing value thing with every other existing value thing as ratios of magnitudes of socially necessary labor time. Money is a social relationship that in its necessary autonomization is the investiture of, i.e., it both dresses up and conceals an equalizing abstraction. Money can be the dressing up of this function because it is itself a commodity. In a society of generalized exchange, capital being the first of that kind, without intention or design, our collective doing produces the set of relations that makes exchange generalizable in the first place, value, and that can only be expressed in a form that we can carry around in our pocket, money. Marx demonstrates that despite appearances, there is no such thing as a discrete independent form of value, including money. Every value form automatically, by virtue of it being a value form, animates a ratio, a one-to-one relationship between otherwise incommensurable things. For example, every single commodity, again by virtue of what a commodity is, carries and externalizes the universe of all other existing commodities in the body of its equivalent. Money is money because it is the form of appearance of the value of every commodity, not the representation of a value embodied in commodity. Money is not quite a representation of value in this way. It is a definite magnitude of value whose function as general equivalent is to be the body of value of every other commodity, allowing it to step into the place of every other commodity and facilitate, after its first function, measure of value, its second function, means of circulation. It is a function that emerges necessarily with the system of universal exchange and is simultaneously posited as the condition of ongoing exchange for the entirety of capital's zombie span. What this means is that money as value form is what Marx calls the direct incarnation of social labor, or pure sociality. As historical substance, this dynamic at the core of money represents a tremendous opportunity, what I've called utopian raw material. What are the characteristics of this new historical raw material that Marx calls pure sociality? This is what he says in chapter 1, quote, "Commodity owners can put things into a relation as commodities only when they treat one another as people whose wills reside in those things, and an owner doesn't acquire another's commodity unless both parties are willing. Each person acquires someone else's commodity only through the act of will common to both." Unquote. Here, Marx is describing the emergence of a new social relation of mutuality, of reciprocity, mutual indebtedness even, that lies outside the authority of either party, the creation of their collaboration, and yet external to each. In other words, something other than the compulsion of customary or traditional relations, which is also to say, outside of the attributes and ascriptions of either party. In its capitalist expression, this relation of mutuality takes the juridical form of the contract and the mutual recognition in legal terms of owners of private property. But the relation is not juridical in origin. Its legal form, one aspect of its capitalist form, and one which comes into the world as an actual history of extreme violence, are logical derivatives of that relation, but they're not the only possible derivatives. The DNA of the relation is the collective doing that objectifies universal exchange, the putting of people into relation with each other for the purpose of their reproduction, carried out through the exchange of the products of their labor, thereby turning that labor into socialized, abstract labor. Now, this is quite a fantastic thing. For Marx, this is a historical development to be exploited, given that we now have no choice but to do so, a development of absolute potential, a development of real material possibilities. Again, as Marx expounds, the universality of human needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, the absolute working out of human beings' creative potentialities are created through universal exchange. The form of money that emerges as a necessity in a capitalist mode of production at its core is simply the objectified outgrowth of that social relation of mutuality identified at the beginning of C1, yes, turned into something monstrous in its capitalist form. But if we take the social substance of universal exchange as theoretically separable from its capitalist expression, what are the various expressions of this same dynamic that Marx argues are not only exploitable, but are the material possibilities of an associated mode of production in embryo? Another term for that possibility is division of labor. It's not an accident that Marx elaborates upon the real but unrealized possibility objectified by a growing division of labor in chapter 3, the chapter on money. Quote, "The quantitative arrangement of the social organism of production, which displays its dejecta membra in the system of the division of labor, is just as spontaneously arising and arbitrary as its qualitative counterpart. Our commodity owners learn then that the same division of labor that makes them into independent private producers also makes the social production process and their relations within it independent of them, the producers themselves. They learn that their independence from one another emerges and is complemented by a system of all-round dependence." Unquote. A system of all-round material dependence, a system of mutual obligation and indebtedness. This is the social relation that is the material condition for the full flourishing of human needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, creative potentialities, and so on. Money in a capitalist mode of production expresses a social power, the direct social incarnation of all human labor. Capital is the perverted and topsy-turvy situation where that social power is put in the hands of an individual as private property. It's not money at its concept we want to abolish, but rather its capitalist formation. The beyond capital potential of that social power or capacity, where socially produced wealth remains the commonwealth of the collectivity, could, in this thought experiment, realize a system where, for example, healthcare reaches every human being that requires it, where food finds its way to every instance of hunger, where housing is provided for all, rather than global austerity, a global model of comfort and abundance, of global obligation and indebtedness, presaged, Marx argues, as unrealized possibility by the figure of world money. Quote, only on the global market does money begin to function in its full capacity as the commodity whose natural form is also the directly social form for realizing human labor in abstracto. Money's actual mode of existence becomes adequate to the concept of money. Worldwide money functions as the universal means of payment, the universal means of purchasing, and also the absolute social materialization of wealth as such, universal wealth, unquote. This figure of wealth blows right past, almost past the imagination altogether, but certainly past any individual image of it. It is an image of the historical process of socialization itself, the formation of social wealth, pure sociality, ultimately, necessarily, singular and universal. Thank you.
Now we have our very own Amit.
Thank you, John, for organizing this event and all the other departments and programs supporting it. Let me begin with a few general observations on the historical context surrounding the recent translations of Marx's Capital and the earlier one. In the 1970s, Marxist political economy experienced a resurgence with New Left review books and Penguin commissioning the first English translation of Grundrisse in 1973. They also released new translations of Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3, between 1976 and 1981, and each prefaced by a prominent Marxist economist, Ernest Mandel, in addition to being the leader of Fourth International at the time. And also Penguin published collections of Marxist political writings and works of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, among others. This period, in my view, saw Marxist economic studies thrive. However, starting in the 1990s and intensifying in the actually even all the way 2000, Marxism began to lose ground to other left-wing ideologies, such as left liberalism, postmodernism, and schools like post-colonialism and post-Marxism. These alternatives focused on identity politics, market-friendly policies, and rejected overarching projects of societal transformations. Despite this shift, many Marxist economists have not fallen to despair. They continue to study the exploitation caused by capitalism, believing that understanding and exposing these issues is key to changing the world. They hope their work will encourage younger radical economists to recognize the lasting relevance of Marxist capital over more fashionable but fragmented economic theories. It is in this historical context that the Princeton edition appears, and it will also make the significance of capital recognized once again, I hope. Moving to the Princeton edition, I want to start by acknowledging Paul Reitter's tremendous effort in translating Capital. Back in 2022, I attended a couple of his Zoom workshops and exchanged emails with him. He also shared an early version of a chapter, for which I'm grateful. I also want to congratulate him on his recent Guggenheim Fellowship. I wish he could be with us here today. Considering the time constraint, I want to comment first on a couple of political economy terms, then on the choice of the edition, and finally on the index. Let me start the first term, rent. As is widely known, the category of rent as a specific form of surplus value is fundamental to Marxist analysis of capitalism. but it also plays a crucial role in his analysis of pre-capitalist agricultural modes of production. In his later years, Marx became increasingly interested in varieties of pre-capitalist agrarian relations, especially those in Asia, including Russia, Japan, and Ottoman Empire. This interest is reflected in his ethnological notebooks and also to some extent in Capital itself. One example appears in Capital, where Marx discusses the Japanese agricultural mode of production, specifically in the context of lack of transition to money rent. But what is this transition from? Here, the Reitter translation renders the original German term literally as natural rent. However, in my view, the more accurate and contextually appropriate term would be rent in kind. There are two reasons for this. First, in the mainstream economics, natural rent usually refers to rent derived from natural resources, such as oil or minerals, not a form of payment. Second, and more importantly, within the political economy tradition, rent in kind and money rent form a standard binary. And in the context of Marx's discussion, which concerns forms of rent payment under different agrarian relations, I think it is clear that rent in kind is what he had in his mind. Second term, unproductive. This translation has chosen to replace Marx's term unproductive labor with non-productive labor due to criticism from feminist scholars regarding Marx's application of the term to domestic labor. As a result, unproductive labor is referred to as non-productive in the main text when Marx uses it, although the original term remained when referred by Smith and Ricardo. The distinction between productive and unproductive activities or labor is also relevant to the classification of consumption activities. Marx categorizes the use of means of production as productive consumption, while the personal consumption of the members of capitalist class is labeled as unproductive consumption. Although unproductive consumption is not inherently offensive, this edition has also changed that to non-productive consumption. It is somewhat understandable to call unproductive labor non-productive, but calling a type of consumption non-productive rather than unproductive makes no sense. The choice of the edition. There is a whole body of literature focusing on identifying the most reliable and representative version of Volume 1. The first French translation attracts much attention in this literature because it is the last completed Volume 1 text that Marx actively worked on. Will Roberts discusses this literature in his informative essay on the French translation at the end of the current edition. Also, according to some, in French translation, Marx even wrote a new version of the first volume. Because this new English translation is based on the second German edition, it does not include some critical changes in the French edition. I'll give you one example. That is the compositions of capital. As we know, there are three: organic, technical, and value compositions. These concepts are especially relevant to Marx's theories on the foreign rate of profit and the reserve army of labor. Although Marx already developed these concepts in the early 1860s, he did not include either the technical or value compositions in the second German edition. Marx used all three compositions for the first time in the French edition of Capital. But this fact is not mentioned by Reitter in his appendix, which exclusively discusses the significant changes in the French edition. Therefore, readers of the translation will only learn about the organic composition. For the technical and value compositions, they should consult with the other English translations. Let me move to the index. Comparatively speaking, the first notable difference between the Princeton and the Penguin indices is their size. The Penguin index is significantly more comprehensive, consisting of 16 pages compared to this edition's 8 pages. Fox, or the editors of Penguin edition, demonstrate a greater familiarity with and sensitivity to political economy terms crucial to Marx's arguments. Marx's original concept of surplus value, along with its production and appropriation, is foundational to his theory and central to his critique of both classical political economy and alternative theories of profit. In fact, Marx himself emphasized this point in a letter to Engels shortly before the publication of Capital. He said the following: "The best 2 points in my book are the twofold character of labor and the treatment of surplus value regardless of its particular forms as profit, interest, ground rent, etc." Among the alternative theories Marx criticizes in Capital is the abstinence theory of profit, advanced by Senior. Marx criticized this theory extensively, devoting several pages to its refutation. Interestingly, while Senior is listed in the Princeton Index, his abstinence theory is not. Other important surplus value related concepts introduced by Marx in Capital include absolute surplus value, relative surplus value. As capitalism develops, relative surplus value production becomes increasingly central, more plausible and important to capitalists than absolute surplus value. However, this shift is not fully reflected in the index. While absolute surplus value is indexed, relative surplus value is not. Composition of capital, unfortunately the Princeton edition index does not include any of the compositions of capital, even the organic composition which exists actually in the Princeton edition. Unproductive labor, productive labor. The index only indicates references to non-productive labor, but let me repeat that. The index only includes references to non-productive labor, but none to unproductive labor, given the fact that it is used in the edition by Smith and Ricardo. It is also puzzling why the index does not include productive labor. Other terms in the index, and let me just cite a couple of them. The index has other hard to understand choices for exclusion. Let me mention some of those excluded terms: profit, the terms equivalent and relative forms of value, centralization of capital, concentration of capital, enclosures, reserve army of labor, and usurer and circulating capital, though fixed capital is indexed. Lastly, while browsing through the index, I came across the name Henry Ashford. Since it was a name I couldn't remember, I first looked at one of the 2 pages where this name appeared, and I saw that Ashford's name was mentioned in a quote Marx made by Nassau Senior. In other words, Senior was referring to Ashford as the owner of a cotton mill. In this quote, Ashford compares the harm, monetary harm, caused by a worker abandoning an ordinary spade to abandoning an expensive machine. Paul North, editorial footnote after the quote, also explains that Senior was referring to Ashford, so there would be no misunderstanding. However, Ashford's first name is not mentioned in the footnote, the quote, or anywhere else in Capital. In fact, when I checked the listed sources Marx used, it was clear that this Ashford was Edmund Ashford, the younger brother and business partner of Henry Ashford. In fact, Henry Ashford's name is not mentioned at all in Capital, but it is in the index of the present edition. More interestingly, since this quote has not been checked in its original English source since Marx, unfortunately Ashford's reference to 100 pounds as the loss due to workers abandoning a machine has always been translated, quote unquote, as 100,000 pounds, including the Princeton edition. As far as I know, the first person to notice this was Thomas Kuczynski. This mistake was corrected by him with an editorial footnote in his new text edition of Capital, Volume 1, published in 2017 in German, and its English translation will be out next year, hopefully. Thank you.
I'm happy to be here, and I'm sorry that Paul Reitter is not here. He speaks very eloquently. He's also much funnier than I am. It's going to be very difficult to respond to all these great comments, which I've noted down. I will say that the index was done by Princeton, not by us, and they really fell down on the job at the very last moment. So it's also not the best way to read a book, let's say. I would point you to the commentary on important issues in the footnotes, the editorial footnotes. Let's see where to start. The best way to talk about Capital is from a revolutionary perspective. Every edition of Capital should live up to one's hopes for a socialist future. It is true, as Will said, that this edition was made by non-Marxists, at least at the beginning, in a post-socialist world, in what we were calling the 1,000-year reign of capital, in which we're just in the first quarter, possibly. That's what we assumed when we made this. What would you do to make this intelligible? Another version of this that is, what would you do to make this book readable by a 20-year-old angry Midwesterner? Which we hope will be a future of a different revolution to come in, well, tomorrow. And so we made some decisions. The first decision was to pick the second edition, which Ahmet rightly calls into question. Really, there is no perfect edition. There is no finished edition, although I agree that this does stand on its own in a way that certainly when one is reading it, one takes it as a kind of like one takes a teacher in college, say, this is a whole thing, I'm going to learn this whole thing. And then after that, you discover the fact that it's nested in 3 volumes. You can't understand the discussions of value and their limits in volume 1 until you read volume 3. We are, by the way, getting started on volume 2 now, and we will do both of them, taking into account some of the criticisms. What we really need in English are a translation or a translation of the first edition. We have here one of the second edition, and we need something like access to the French translation because it isn't really clear what's important in that edition. A lot of people have opinions, but one thing we learned in doing this is that an edition or a book is a whole book, and it's not reducible either to independent passages or independent terms, as if it were just carrying a lexicon, like a book is carrying its index, and there are important concepts. Those can be argued over, but in fact, Marx wrote a very complicated prose epic, if you want to put it that way, where you are brought through a set of teachings that lead from one to the other about value, where by the time you get to relative surplus value, you've already understood what absolute surplus value is and its limitations. Not only that, but the limitations in those sections of the book on struggles over absolute surplus value, that is, struggles over the length of the working day, which Capital developed a way ingeniously in those years to get around. That was relative surplus value and technological change. So this particular edition, which by the way is 99% similar to all other editions, what gets quibbled about are important, but they are a small percentage of this immense amount of work that Marx did to put this together. What you get here is a kind of a whole, I will say that. Even though I guess I would say it stands on its own in the first gesture of getting into the Capital project. But after that, it has to be relativized to volumes 2 and 3 and other issues, revolutionary issues, issues of action. As to what this edition is for, if it's not for a movement whose needs are in some sense imposed on the translation and on the edition, we really left that open. We tried to make it as available for English language scholars who don't have access to German, of which there are a lot. People really rely on this. And so we tried to give access to German concepts and even images. The that we like the best and that people get excited about is Gallerte, a funny German suet that you would feed to your dog, or you might eat yourself if you were poor, that was made of leftover chopped up pieces of different kinds of meat and turned into a bare gelatinous blob, which is Paul Reitter's translation, I think a much better one, of what happens to homogenized human labor when it's abstracted, and you can't see any of the concrete differences in it. We think that Marx meant to do criticism in a whole number of ways. One of the ways he could do criticism was by disgusting you and using the term Gallerte, which had no place in political economy. The bare gelatinous blob at least gives you the slightest turn of stomach. The other thing you get from this edition is Reiter's ear for humor. He was a translator of Karl Kraus, who was the most biting, acerbic Austrian Jewish wit of the late 19th, early 20th century. And you can hear that another mode of critique for Marx is jokes, is ridicule, is irony, is sarcasm. Also is playing roles. There are sections in the book that are written in free indirect discourse in which Marx takes the position of the capitalist. I can read you one. Again, I think I'm arguing that it's not just a matter of terminological freshness where we get the terms right, but that for Marx, it didn't matter if capitalism came down because you had surplus value right or because you ridiculed its representatives. In fact, he did both. Here's Marx in using free indirect discourse as a novel rhetorical method. Our capitalist now becomes defiant and defensive, rearing up on his hindquarters. Not very nice to capitalists. He asks, can a worker make commodities out of thin air simply by using his arms and legs? Didn't he supply his worker with the material the worker needed to embody his labor, and in which his labor is thus embodied? Given that penniless persons make up the vast majority of society, hasn't our capitalist rendered an immeasurable service to society by providing the means of production, namely the cotton and the spindle? And he goes on in this deeply ironic tone, but also speaking both in his own voice and in the voice of the capitalist, in third person, in direct discourse, so he can ridicule and embody the perspective at once. It's a novel form, and it doesn't come out in previous translations. Marx is a great writer, a resourceful writer. I'm going to respond to Bev Best's really taking Volume 1 in a revolutionary spirit. I can't really say this is a right or wrong account of the new translation, but I can respond in kind, having worked on it for 6 years and been teaching Marx for many years, and am a big fan of her work. I'm not sure money is emancipatory. I'll give one reason. I like the idea of looking forward rather than backwards, not looking at pre-capitalist models, which is something that Marx does, Marx and Engels do, others do, for a mode of association that would not be so detrimental to the majority of the population. It's true that money has several functions, and I appreciate going through them where money does do something revolutionary, but for Marx there are revolutions and revolutions. The technological revolution is completely in service of extracting more labor and de-skilling the labor you have. So if the revolution of money, making everything commensurable, is emancipatory towards a socialism, I think the one problem is that it has another function in addition to making commodities commensurable and embodying a kind of mutuality, social mutuality, where wills take each other into account. When you pay for something, you are, in effect, engaging with others' work, engaging with others' wills. Money as a social power, I'm happy to think this all the way through to the end with Beverly Vest. But I do think that money in its independence takes the control of the products of labor and makes it possible that someone else owns it. And that's an intrinsic character of the money form under capitalism that isn't emancipatory of at least that majority of the population. It is what allows me to own your capacities, both as a laborer that I hire or through your products, without having done any work myself. So my only suggestion is this would be something I'd like to hear overcome. Money is quintessentially alienable. Coming to Ahmet's, I think, very good points, I argued for this very ungainly translation, non-production labor. Because really what I think Marx is talking about is what happens in production and what happens outside of it. And in English, you have this unfortunate overlap with productive in the sense of generating something, being generative or not being generative. It's very hard, and we always had the first-time readers in mind. It's very hard not to hear when you say unproductive a negative moral evaluation, especially in the era of high or advanced capital where productive is already assumed to be a good. So I argued for non-production labor, which is to say outside of production, which would include reproductive labor and other sorts of things like that. Although these things ultimately feed into production and could be considered part of production, the analytic distinction, I think, is important. And he didn't like that, so we compromised on non-productive, which may be ungainly. This is how the working together went. He would propose things solving long-term problems, and even in understanding the German, and we would argue over them and come up with solutions, some of which I think are very good, like his solution for the kind of ontological quality that a commodity has, ghostly objecthood. It's an infinite step forward over the previous translation, where the previous translation calls it transcendent. We stick with a fairly literal translation of the German, sensual, supersensual. I think two of the main steps forward in this edition that we really worked on and were conscious of are making the peculiar ontology of things under capital clear, not just things, but people who become masks and representatives. And the other is the value vocabulary. We benefited from 30 years or more, 100 years, depending how you count, of thinking of Volume 1 as being the drama of value, not the drama of workers directly, or of historical materialism or other things, but of the development of this very, very strange phenomenon under capital that is at the center. And so we tried to make the value vocabulary very understandable. In a post-socialist world, it seems like what we need to understand is how this automatic subject, Marx calls it that in the early chapters, controls us. Thank you.
Sure, I could do that. Yeah. Maybe we should open the floor right away, or?
Up to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any comments, any questions from the floor? None?
Have you bought the new translation? Yet. It's on the Princeton website. It's on sale for $20, which is a steal.
Yeah. I guess the question I had is I am very much approaching the angry 20-year-old you described, the Western angry 20-year-old. But I think for a lot of Marx, his writing, we get into the language can be very hard to understand for somebody who's not necessarily an academic or in the intellectual circles. And I'm wondering how we can better communicate with people outside of the kind of insular circles we built for ourselves in understanding how capital works without necessarily using terms that go over their heads or like having to explain it in a way that's more succinct, I suppose. Big question, but important one.
key question.
Should we get a few more questions, or do you want to ask? Is there any other? Yes.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I had a question for Paul. You said that when you embarked on the project, you weren't a Marxist, but you suggested perhaps after completing the 6 years of work, maybe one or both of you are. And what was it about doing the work that converted you? And I'm also trying to reconcile two comments, just introducing the panel about how that volume 1 of Capital was written for workers, and then how you were emphasizing the role of value. So how do you think you have made value as a concept more accessible to people struggling? Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is also a question for Professor North. And it's pretty similar to the question that just got asked, but I was just wondering if, as you say, this translation of Capital is 99% similar to other editions, I was just wondering what the impetus was to embark on a new translation, and then like why this translation? I know that you've, as the other question asked, you've talked about some of the things that you did, but what particularly makes it more accessible to this angry 20-year-old Midwesterner?
Okay, maybe I'll do this quickly because they're all the same question. It's great. And you all, I'm going to turn to you to jump in and add things, because the question, how do you make capital accessible to workers, was a question that plagued Marx. Engels thought about it. Engels wrote a great thesis of it early on, and there's no end of guides to it. And the thing I like to recommend is an article by my colleague Michael Denning on the 150 years of workers' reading groups of Capital. There is a tradition of studying Capital in unions and in workplaces and in informal settings, which suggests that it isn't over anybody's head. On the other hand, it's over everybody's head, in some sense, including Marx's. It isn't the best exposition, and he kept reworking it and making notes about how to make it better. He claims that the French translation is more written in the people's tongue, especially because it's in French, which he thought had a kind of revolutionary history that made it more easier to take up, or a population that was ready to receive it in France. So it is a problem. The answer to your question, I think, is to write the guide to Capital. That can help people, and run Capital reading groups everywhere. And I think the reason it has to start with Capital Volume 1, is that the system does everything. This is the answer to why I would call myself a Marxist now, is that the system does everything that Marx says it does, and that's a lot of things, and they're all in there. A simplification doesn't get to it. For example, the fact that it presents itself in ways that it isn't, that it appears in one way. The fact that everything under Capital is a set of two things, at least, that are in tension with one another, and practically in tension, not just logically in tension. Use value and exchange value, it's all fine to say, but in fact, the thing has to be usable practically, just like it has to be exchangeable practically. And I mean, in a way, to do this better, you'd have to rewrite the whole thing with all of its complexity. And I think that's what Marx discovered. It is that complex, and otherwise you'd be lying. The answer to your question is, when you spend so much time close to the text, you can probably attest to this too, both of you can, it becomes like a laser cutting through the experience, both economic experience and social experience of the moment. And there isn't anything else like that. As to why this edition, why the translation, I can say that better. I think what was missing, the main thing missing in the previous translation especially, was the range of Marx's styles. And I maintain, as I was saying, that that isn't a writerly conceit. It isn't a matter of like being gebildet in the German sense, being very well educated, and he couldn't do anything else, he was just erudite. But that every one of those forms, including quoting literary texts, was a way to attack capital. The great joke running through the first 3 or 4 chapters, where the priest is going around trying to sell his Bible, his own commodity, in order to buy schnapps. Well, it's a good joke, but it's also, it's a trenchant critique of capitalism in religious terms and religion in terms of capitalism. Those things, if they don't come through, you're missing half the enterprise. Do you want to add?
I'll just add one thing, I think, which is that I think the difficulty is a difficulty with the world more than it is a difficulty with capital, right? In the sense that if you are content to be a technocratic liberal, you don't need that many people in the world to understand how the system works, right? You need a few Brahmins who can direct the matters from the commanding heights, and that's good enough. If you are an arch-conservative, you don't need many people to understand how the world works at all. In fact, it's bad if very many people understand how the world works. What you need are a few people who have the levers of power to understand well enough how to use them. But if you are a thoroughgoing egalitarian who thinks that everyone should be free and thinks that the system that we live in is one of global scope, and that we have, sort of stumbled into, via history, into a condition of all-around dependence on one another, whereby we can't get by without one another, then you are committed to putting high epistemic demands on a lot of ordinary people, because you're not going to be content with a few people understanding how things work. We all have to participate in understanding how things work. That's the difficulty of the situation. So I guess I feel like if that describes you and that describes your politics, then you just have to bite the bullet and recognize that the world is difficult and complicated, and that trying to understand that difficulty and that complication and making that difficulty and complication generally understandable is just part of the project.
Okay, I should admit that.
It's okay. Ben has a hand up, just saying.
All right. Should I?
No.
I obviously understand the observation that reading Capital is very difficult for workers generally. But at the same time, based on my experience in trade union education in Turkey, that I run into many workers and initiated actually a couple of reading Capital groups within the trade unions themselves, that actually they are capable of understanding. I can't generalize this, but definitely there is a segment of workers who are interested in reading it and fully understanding, in some instances actually better than many academics. And I want to say something about also guidebooks. What I have in my mind, for example, David Harvey's books. I think these books are not very useful because they almost present themselves as an alternative to capital, as large as capital, sometimes as difficult as capital. What I have in my mind, a kind of alternative to those books for specific purposes, depending upon political, junction and group of people that you involve in organizing, changing the world. In that regard, a book based on capital, focusing on exploitation, surplus value extraction, and competition, not exclusively among capitals, but also competition among workers, reserve army of labor. I mean, those issues, I think, if included in a guidebook based on capital, would be much more useful in workers' comprehension of overall intent of capital than going into technicalities and differences between compositions of capital, for example. So therefore, I think instead of comprehensive guides or alternative to capital type of thick volumes, I think we should consider producing something like this. Ma'am, it's yours.
Yeah, thanks. I think I do have thoughts about the, is this accessible? Is the text accessible to workers? I read Capital Volume 1 with a group of workers almost not every year, but more than every second year, I'd say, because they're also called students. And the accessibility of the text is never the problem. I mean, it doesn't take many weeks before. It's like learning a language. It's not that the language is inaccessible. It's that as Paul Reitter in the translator's preface said, Mark, what's so fascinating and energizing about reading the text, what's so wonderful about reading Capital is to watch Marx struggle, invent a new language as he's going along, to try to capture in analysis the things that he's trying to capture. And the language is so wonderful and wild and yes, disgusting and funny and sarcastic. And that's one of the things that keeps you reading, that keeps students/workers reading. But it's not the accessibility, and yes, that's new and different, and but it's only a few weeks before we all in the group start falling into that new language and start kind of reading it as if we're kind of picking up this language for ourselves. The problem is not the language, it's time. And it's the time and the ability to sustain a life wherein you can actually find the time to sustain the reading of it. So, there's never a problem with when students get to the end of a semester and we've worked our way through. There's no accessibility problem anymore. It's who has been able to kind of keep the project going. And most do, I have to say, from my experience, is that if you start with a group, you maybe will lose a couple, but not many. But yeah, I don't, from my experience anyway, and I wouldn't have known that before the experiment, taking on the experiment, that it is that by the end of working with the text after a number of weeks, it's not so much. It's absolutely doable. Students, and students/workers pick up that language. We all work together and pick up that language really quite quickly.
You mean, of course, the new translation, right? It's okay, doesn't matter.
Of course I do. And yes, I did. The last time that I read, I have begun now to use the new translation. And for the first time, I can say, I had students, this has never happened before after just the first week of reading, but I did have students come back to me saying, I was not expecting it to be so clear and so contemporary sounding. I think we're actually expecting something that was much more, that was going to be inaccessible, and that was not their experience of it from the get-go. Mind you, this was a different, this was not the reading capital class, and we didn't start with the first 3 chapters. So I'll report back after.
Okay.
That's in the fall. In the fall, it's going to be the first time where I'll actually do the reading capital seminar, where we start from the beginning and go through to the end. And we are going to use the new translation.
That will be awesome.
Yeah.
I do think one thing I was just going to say, that the German is very clear. There are dense dialectical parts. I think the Faux renders it a lot less clear, and because it over-dialecticizes, and like translations of Freud, it invents technical terms like integument, for example, where the German word is just shell, Hülle. And unlike the more Aveling translation, which gives it a kind of fun, gentlemanly, and also metaphoric rhetoric, which is not in the original text at all. They kind of try to make it more accessible. But the German is very straight, very straightforward, speaking directly to you, saying this is how it is. I think, just to go back to that question about accessibility, one of the big problems with Capital is that when you open the book, you're reading about a system that you thought was otherwise, that everyone told you was otherwise, that actually hides, that has a whole set of different names. And so the difficulty of Marx, as Bev was saying, is that it actually names the things as they are, as some part of your unconscious recognized them to be. Exploitation, for one. It isn't that workers don't know they're being exploited, but they may not have the exact words for the shape of the exploitation, the source of the exploitation, the magnitude of the exploitation, etc. And so there is a phenomenological surprise coming in the book that I think takes some time to take on board.
Can I leap in one more time really quickly? That's absolutely something that I found now reading Capital with students / workers. I keep doing that, but I think it's important. Now is that it has never not been the case that it's the experience of finding a language for what people are experiencing, for which there was no everyday ordinary language, is such you just even the affective experience of that is unmistakable. You just look,
That's liberation too.
Yeah.
On the floor.
Hey. Hi, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this incredible talk. I have several nitty-gritty questions that are probably not worth asking, so I'll just stick to a more sort of non-granular one for now. Knowing your work, Paul, and then also knowing Marx's Inferno, William, I am very much on the side of not reading the 3 volumes of Das Kapital as a text of economic theory, right? And so, or not strictly that. You could read it in a million ways. You could read it as political theory as you do. You could read it as Moby Dick, as Michael Denning sometimes does, right? So there's many ways to read it. That being said, did your posture of coming into the economics department here, how did that filter what you thought you might say? I'm curious, especially as a person that vehemently does not do, I should not be coming out of the closet right now about this, but I try not to do econometric work, and I try to figure out what does it mean not to do that. So I'm just curious sort of what your posture is coming into that. But thank you for this wonderful talk and for this book.
Hi, yeah, I don't mean to stir anything, but I was just really intrigued by Beverly's comments on money, and I've never thought of it that way, but then I also, I think I'm on the side of Paul's comment and just thinking of it as like not fundamentally emancipatory, and I was just wondering if you were able to respond to those set of critiques. That would just be really hard. Thank you.
One more, yeah, or two more.
Hello. I also was curious about sort of the emancipatory or non-emancipatory value of money in relation to, I was thinking about Jasper Byrne's new book that just came out, and the release for that book, also sort of tribute for Joshua Clover. They were discussing alternatives, and sometimes that, I believe it's in the book as well, on sort of post-Lenin labor vouchers in the Soviet Union and the sort of failure of that system to work, essentially, and how it sort of put managers in a very horrendous position in the Soviet Union. And so I guess my question, sort of along this lines, would be, if money is not emancipatory, then what would be, you know, what's an alternative there? How do we even begin to comprehend that? Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm the third one to ask about money. Yeah, I mean, I think regarding Beverly's comments, well, I mean, I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but it seemed to me that when you talk about universal sociality or the raw material of, or utopian raw material, it seems to me that there's a casting of money as a sort of positive instrument. And for me, the whole question about money as the general representative of value is the inversion of the subject and object. So commodities become alive, and humans are just really bringing them to market. And in this, there is, I mean, the whole issue of commodity fetishism is that the commodity producer has no control over the social character of the labor. So they become totally emptied out of their own subjectivity. So I think that's the function of money, mainly. So I'm not sure if I understood the whole argument. And also I wanted to go back to Amit's comment on non-productive versus unproductive labor. I think it's not just a semantical question. It really amounts to whether you want to consider this as, nothing is non-productive in a sense, even consumption is productive, because it's all a question of how you're going to account for the production of value, and if that, let's say, domestic labor is actually going to be part of how you want to see how capital is moving or come into your calculation of the rate of profit or not. I mean, I think it has practical bearing on how we think about capitalism. Anyway.
Most of them to you, right?
Maybe, yeah, maybe we should take the questions on money from Bev first.
Would you?
And then
Bev?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it, I can't hear when it's not the microphone. Is it over to me?
Yes,
Oh.
yes.
Oh, you have to talk in the
I'll do this.
microphone.
I'll try
yeah,
to do
Bev,
this.
sorry, I just thought it would be more efficient for you to handle some of the questions about money first. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, there's nothing. It's interesting that people landed on the word emancipatory, which I don't think I used, and I'd have to think about that. I don't see anything emancipatory about money in its capitalist form. So that's not what I was trying to do. And in fact, the reason why I wanted to come back to think about kind of economic theory, I'm thinking about the first question that said the last thing I think about when I read Capital, I'm not thinking about its economic analysis. I'm thinking about, which I agree, but I agree with that. But it also seems to me that the way that value theory or Marxist theory of value has traveled quite, it seems to me, successfully over the past 15 years or so. It's the one place where it's kind of not being taken up is in the question of economics. So that Marx, I think, lays out a theory of money primarily, not just, and I want to look at other places, but in the first three chapters of Capital One, and I think it's a much more full, comprehensive or kind of sustained theory of money than it's often represented to be. And I think it's one that's not only can be brought to bear on the contemporary kind of phenomenon of capitalist money, but has to be. I don't think we can understand the most practical everyday things, dysfunctions about money, whether it's its relationship to credit, and is it credit or is it not credit, or is it a commodity or is it not a commodity, and why does that matter? And we can't explain inflation. I think Marx demonstrates why that every explanation of inflation that doesn't have at the core of that analysis an understanding of the movement of value just becomes another quantity theory of money that gets us nowhere. And maybe for some, that's for those, there are some who will benefit from the fact that we don't have a clear understanding of how money works. But I think that the whole money itself is a map, in the way that Marx analyzes it or theorizes money, is a map of the entire workings of capital's inner workings. And so I want to demonstrate that, and why you need a value theory drawn straight through the way we think about the kind of everyday workings of the economy to this day. So it seems to be the one place where some will argue, well, the one thing that, we can't take Marx is the one anachronism maybe in Marx's analysis is with money, because money has changed so much and credit has changed so much, but I don't think that's the case. So I'm going to try and take that on. But I think the other thing, what I'm trying to think about is and I have a feeling, and you're right, I didn't have time, 12 minutes to really be persuasive at all about what I want to say about money as performing what Marx calls his dialectical reversal, where the very development of the thing, according to its own terms, drives right out of that form itself, or pushes up against the limits of that form. So Marx's theory of money is a theory of crisis. Chapter 3 is a theory of crisis. That's what chapter 3, money chapter, is about. And he demonstrates the way that money, and it's when I'm talking about money as it's in its non-capitalist form, or as pure sociality, as something that I think Marx is arguing that it is a kind of dynamic that's introduced to history that is in fact a problem for capital as much as anything else. It's inherently in its capitalist form crisis. The crisis can't be contained. And I think what I don't know, we'll see when I get there. I'm not quite there, but my intuition anyway is that you can think through money at the level of its concept as a way of thinking as a mode of sociality it introduces to history that can actually be an expression of something quite different, an associated mode of production. I'll stop there, knowing that I don't expect that's going to be satisfying because I can't really make the demonstration right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You should talk about how you feel coming into an economics.
I will be completely frank, I didn't really think about it that much, which I maybe should have. But I think the fact that I got the invitation from John and that it was going to be Paul and Paul, I didn't really think about audience too much, which is kind of blockheaded of me, but it's the truth. So.
But we're in the house of Wolf and Resnick, so we feel okay. I guess my response, coming from the tradition of German idealism, critical theory, though not in the reductive cultural sense of it, is that capital is kind of the basis for economics. It gives a social and ontological view of what needs to be in place for capitalism to work and to appear as just economical. That's what Marx tried to do, to really pull back the veil on this funny invention of the depending how you think about it, the 17th, late 17th, 18th century, the economy, a funny substantialization of social relations, which then allows the things that have happened in economics and also in capitalism, which is econometrics and the quantification of everything, hiding what the kinds of beings are that allow this false picture to take place, and what sort of position humans and social relations are put in to make it possible to even think that you could, privatize your retirement, for example. Think of the set of social and ontological conceits you have to be able to do that, and the blindnesses that go along with it. So capital gives the foundations for any economic way of looking at things.
I guess we can take a few more questions maybe on that. Any other? All right, so maybe. And
Thank you very much.
good, thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. Welcome to join us for dinner.
Will she see us? I don't know. Oh yeah, maybe she will.
Yeah,